Prison isn't just walls and bars. It's layers, levels, each one darker, colder, more permanent than the last. From short sentences to life without parole. And finally, to death itself. Tonight, we're descending through 7 levels of prison life, told through the stories of 7 women whose crimes shocked the world. From Casey Anthony's 31 days of silence after her daughter vanished, to Felicity Huffman's humiliating fall from Hollywood privilege, from Michelle Lael-Norsworthy's decades behind medium security walls, to Jodi Arias's forever in maximum security, and beyond, all the way down to Lisa Montgomery's execution on federal death row. Each level reveals not just a punishment, but a different kind of prison. Some cages are made of steel. Others are built from guilt, time, and the weight of a life you can't undo. So before we start this descent, I want to know, what time is it where you're watching right now? And which country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. Because as you're about to hear, prison isn't the same for everyone. Some serve days, some serve decades, and some never leave alive. Now, let's begin with Level 1. Casey Anthony. Level 1. Casey Anthony.
She just admitted to me that she's been trying to find her herself. There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car.
Okay, what is the 3-year-old's name?
Kaylee, C-A-Y-L-E-E, Anthony.
In the summer of 2008, Florida sweltered under its usual heat. But inside one suburban home in Orlando, something far colder was unfolding. 2-year-old Kaylee Anthony had vanished, and her mother, Casey, was telling a story that shifted each time she opened her mouth. First, Kaylee was with a babysitter named Zanny. Then, she was with friends. Then, she had simply gone missing. But neighbors and friends began to notice something else. For 31 days after anyone had last seen Kaylee, Casey acted as if nothing was wrong. She was photographed in clubs, drinking, dancing, and smiling with friends. A white Pontiac Sunfire sat parked at her parents' home, a car that would later reek of decomposition, its trunk hiding stains no detergent could ever wash away. When police were finally called by Casey's mother, Cindy, it was already too late. A frantic 911 call captured Cindy's voice cracking with terror. "It smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." Investigators zeroed in quickly, and Casey's carefully constructed storylines unraveled under the most basic questioning. No nanny named Zanny existed. No babysitter had ever been hired. Every detail she had offered was smoke and mirrors. Casey was arrested, not for murder at first, but for lying. Still, the spotlight was relentless. Each time she appeared in court, the world leaned in closer, hungry for answers about what had happened to the bright-eyed toddler whose face was now plastered on posters and national news. And then came the breaking point, December 2008. A utility worker stumbled upon something in the woods, less than half a mile from the Anthony home. A small skull, tiny bones, a heart-shaped sticker clinging to duct tape that had been wrapped around the child's mouth. Kaylee's remains had been discarded like trash, left to weather and rot in the Florida swamp. This was the moment that changed everything. The discovery ripped through the courtroom drama like a thunderclap. America no longer saw a missing child's case. They saw the undeniable evidence of a life ended. The horror of that duct tape with its faint heart decal lodged itself in the nation's memory, impossible to shake. Casey was indicted for first-degree murder, but here's where the story takes a darker twist. While Kaylee's short life ended in the woods, Casey's life stalled behind steel bars. For nearly 3 years, she lived not as a convicted murderer, but as a woman trapped in pre-trial limbo. Orange jumpsuits, fluorescent lighting, every visit watched through thick glass. she became a study in contradictions, the young mother whose child was dead, yet who hadn't been proven guilty. Inside jail, she wrote letters to other inmates, rambling about faith, trust, and the future she imagined once released. Her words seemed detached from the enormity of the crime surrounding her. To some, she came across as manipulative. To others, naive. But to everyone, she remained an enigma. Was she a grieving mother wrongly accused, or a calculating liar hiding the truth of what she had done? The trial in 2011 became the most watched courtroom spectacle since O.J. Simpson. Prosecutors painted Casey as a woman who wanted to shed the burdens of motherhood, who chose parties and boyfriends over responsibility. They argued Kaylee had been suffocated, her tiny body stored in the trunk of that Pontiac before being dumped in the woods. The defense countered with a bombshell. Kaylee had drowned accidentally in the family pool, and Casey's father, George Anthony, had helped cover it up. It was a narrative meant to cast doubt, to redirect blame, to complicate the neat story prosecutors had built. And then, the verdict. The jury acquitted Casey of murder, manslaughter, and child abuse. She was convicted only of lying to police. Gasps filled the courtroom. Outside, crowds chanted, "Justice for Kaylee," outraged that the woman at the center of it all was walking free after serving just her pre-trial years in jail. Casey Anthony's 3 years behind bars became a haunting example of pretrial detention. Time spent waiting, suspended between accusation and conviction, yet shaping public perception as much as any sentence could. For many, it was never enough. For others, it was proof of a justice system built on reasonable doubt, not emotions. Kaylee's short life ended in silence, hidden under garbage bags and brush. Casey's life after jail began under the weight of a nation's judgment. And to this day, the image that lingers is not just the child's smile frozen in photographs, but that duct tape with the tiny heart, a symbol of innocence smothered and a mother's name forever stained. Level 2. Felicity Huffman.
Actress Felicity Huffman stared straight ahead as she left the courthouse with her husband, actor William H. Macy. She's a convicted felon now.
For years, Felicity Huffman lived in a world of red carpets, designer gowns, and magazine covers. She was an Emmy-winning actress, a face people recognized instantly. Her life looked scripted for success. But in March 2019, her name stopped appearing in entertainment headlines and started appearing in indictments. The charge? Conspiracy to commit mail fraud. Not a violent crime. Not the stuff of true crime horror. But something that struck a nerve with millions of Americans. A Hollywood star caught cheating the system that determines who gets access to higher education. Huffman had paid $15,000 to have her daughter's SAT exam secretly corrected. It was part of a sprawling scheme that ensnared wealthy parents across the country, a plot prosecutors dubbed Operation Varsity Blues. The idea was simple but corrosive. When your child's future is on the line, you don't play fair, you buy your way in. And Felicity Huffman, a woman who had every resource at her fingertips, had chosen to cross that line. When she stood in court and pled guilty, the fall was dramatic. A Hollywood star admitting she had cheated for her child, while ordinary families scraped together everything they had for tutoring sessions, test prep books, and hope. Felicity did something rare for the rich and famous. She accepted responsibility. She didn't fight it. She didn't claim a conspiracy against her. She said she was guilty. But that guilty plea came with a price. In September 2019, a federal judge sentenced her to 2 weeks in prison. 2 weeks doesn't sound like much, but for someone who had lived a life of premieres and privilege, those 14 days would strip away everything she thought defined her. October 15th, 2019. Felicity Huffman walked into the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. She wasn't an actress anymore. She wasn't a celebrity. She was inmate 77806-112. From the moment she entered, the transformation was absolute. Her jewelry gone. Her designer clothes traded for prison-issued khakis. Her freedom replaced by head counts and schedules set by someone else. The middle of her story, the moment that shattered the illusion most, came not in the courtroom, but in those first 24 hours inside. Strip searches, medical intake, a bare-bones bunk in a dormitory shared with dozens of strangers. No private dressing room, no assistants, no handlers, just a cell block echoing with the shuffle of prison shoes and the clang of metal doors. Prison life, even at minimum security, is designed to erase individuality. Meals are ladled onto trays without choice. Lights go out at a set time. Showers are taken in a communal block where privacy doesn't exist. For 11 days, Felicity Huffman lived inside that stripped-down reality. 11 days where every sound reminded her she wasn't in charge anymore. And yet, she endured. Inmates described her as quiet, polite, keeping her head down. No special treatment, no paparazzi. Just another woman in khaki, blending into the system. But the humiliation was already public. Outside the gates, news vans lined up, their cameras capturing every second. A star who once shined on screen was now reduced to mug shots and headlines mocking the fall. On October 25th, after serving just 11 days, Felicity Huffman walked free. She had completed her sentence, one of the shortest stays possible in federal custody. But those days mattered. They became a symbol. To some, proof that the justice system gave the rich a slap on the wrist. To others, a reminder that even the powerful cannot entirely escape accountability. Huffman later said she was deeply ashamed. She admitted she had betrayed her own values, that she had damaged her daughter by trying to help her. Unlike many in her position, she didn't lash out at prosecutors or paint herself as a victim. Instead, she seemed broken by what had happened. And in that brokenness, the world saw the strange paradox of her punishment, harsh enough to humiliate, short enough to spark outrage. Her story shows what minimum security prison really means. It isn't the hardened world of maximum security, where survival is a daily fight. It's the place where non-violent offenders go, white-collar criminals, first-time offenders, people who broke the law, but not with blood on their hands. It's still prison, but it's the gentlest version the system offers. For Felicity Huffman, those 11 days were a scar she will carry forever. Not because the prison broke her, but because the world watched every second of it. She lived the life of an inmate long enough to understand its humiliations, short enough to return home while others remained behind bars for years. Her sentence might have been measured in days, but her reputation was rewritten forever. Felicity Huffman will always be remembered not just for the roles she played, but for those 11 days when Hollywood glamour turned into khaki prison clothes and a life of privilege collided with the sharp edge of justice. Level 3, Michelle Lael-Norsworthy. In '97, a barroom argument in Orange County spiraled into something irreversible. Shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, a man lay dead, and Michelle Lael-Norsworthy's name was etched into California's criminal records. Convicted of second-degree murder, she received a sentence of 17 years to life. What she didn't know then was that her time behind bars would stretch to nearly 3 decades, across walls designed not just to contain but to reshape lives. She entered prison not as Michelle, but as Jeffrey Norsworthy. The state listed her as male, assigned her to men's facilities, and left her to navigate a world already perilous for any inmate. Prison strips identity down to a number, a cell block, a security level. For Michelle, who already knew deep inside that she was living in the wrong body, that stripping away cut even deeper. Medium security prisons are not cages stacked on cages like maximum security, nor are they the relative ease of a minimum security camp. They are something in between. Controlled, closely watched, violent when least expected. Inmates have more freedom of movement than in lockdown yards, but also more exposure to danger. It is the constant tension of being close enough to touch freedom, but far enough that it never comes. Michelle lived inside that world for 28 years. She endured harassment, ridicule, violence. Inmates targeted her for who she was. Guards often turned their backs. Yet in that grim environment, Michelle's story took a turn that would make legal history. In 2015, after years of legal battles, she became the first U.S. inmate ever approved by a federal judge for state-funded gender reassignment surgery. It was a ruling that reverberated far beyond the prison walls. For the first time, a court acknowledged not just the crime that put someone behind bars, but the humanity that remained once they were locked away. This was the pivot point, the moment in the middle of her prison story that captured national attention. Judge John Tigger declared that denying her surgery violated the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. He ruled that Michelle's identity, her right to medical care for gender dysphoria, could not be erased simply because she was incarcerated. The state of California fought back, appealing the decision, arguing that taxpayers should not bear the cost. But for Michelle, the ruling was validation. After decades in medium security cells, after years of being told who she could and could not be, the system had finally acknowledged her reality. Still, the ruling didn't guarantee freedom. Michelle remained behind fences, surrounded by watchtowers, her life defined by headcounts and cell checks. She continued to serve her sentence, the approval for surgery suspended while the state fought its appeals. Even in victory, she remained shackled. When parole finally came in April 2015, Michelle walked out after 28 years inside. She didn't leave as the angry young person who had pulled a trigger in the 1980s. She left as a woman who had fought the state itself for recognition, who had forced the system to admit that incarceration does not erase humanity. Her time in medium security shows a level of prison life many don't think about. It is not the infamous isolation cells or the short stays of celebrity offenders. It is the grinding middle ground. Long years where days blur into weeks, weeks into years, where inmates carve survival out of routines, yard time, cafeteria trays, lineups, lockdowns. For Michelle, every day in those decades also meant fighting for dignity. She faced verbal attacks, threats of physical violence, and the silent cruelty of guards who ignored her pleas for protection. But she also found allies, lawyers who took her case, advocates who saw in her struggle something larger than one inmate's request. Her release didn't erase the decades she spent in state custody, nor the crime that put her there, but it reframed her story. Instead of just being remembered as a convicted murderer, Michelle Lael-Norsworthy became a symbol in the fight for trans rights in prisons. Her case forced a conversation about what justice looks like, not just for victims of crime, but for the people serving sentences. Medium security prisons are built for those deemed too risky for minimum, but not beyond control. For Michelle, they became both cage and crucible. They stripped her of freedom, exposed her to danger, and yet they became the place where her fight for identity was forged. When she stepped out in 2015, she carried with her almost 3 decades of concrete walls and razor wire. But she also carried something rarer, a ruling that acknowledged her as a woman, a victory carved from the hardest years of her life. Level 4, Jodi Arias.
Yes, I did.
Why?
The simple answer is that he attacked me.
June 2008, police in Mesa, Arizona, entered a suburban home that looked ordinary from the street. Inside, they found a scene so violent, so drenched in rage, that even seasoned detectives stood stunned. Travis Alexander, a motivational speaker with a bright future, was lying in his bathroom. his body telling a story of brutality that would echo across the nation. Nearly 30 stab wounds, a slit throat so deep it nearly decapitated him, a gunshot wound to the head. At the center of it all was his ex-girlfriend, Jodi Arias, a woman who, to outsiders, seemed soft-spoken, artistic, almost fragile. But the crime scene revealed something else entirely. The relationship between Jodi and Travis had been volatile, passion tangled with jealousy, intimacy shadowed by obsession. Friends warned Travis she was dangerous. He tried to cut ties, but Jodi didn't let go. Instead, she followed him, called him obsessively, even showed up uninvited. When his body was discovered, suspicion snapped back to her, and soon, the story that would grip true crime audiences for years began to unfold. The trial revealed contradictions that held viewers captive. On the stand, Jodi first denied involvement. Then she admitted she was there, but claimed masked intruders had killed Travis. Finally, she told the jury she had killed him, but in self-defense. Each version clashed with the evidence. Photos of Travis alive, then bleeding, then lifeless, all found on a camera Jodi tried to wash in the washing machine. The middle of this story, the part that held America transfixed, was the raw brutality of the killing. This wasn't a single shot fired in panic. This was overkill, stabbing again and again. A throat cut so savagely it silenced him forever. And then, after all of it, a bullet to the head. The sheer ferocity told investigators what Jodi would never admit. This was not self-defense. This was personal. When the verdict came in May 2013, the jury convicted her of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase dragged on, with jurors split on whether she deserved death. In 2015, the decision landed: life in prison without parole. Jodi Arias would never leave the custody of the Arizona Department of Corrections. And she wouldn't go to just any prison. She was placed in Perryville Prison, a maximum security women's facility. Inside those walls, the world she once knew, boyfriends, cameras, courtroom attention, vanished. What replaced it was steel, concrete, and control. Life in maximum security means living under constant watch. Cells are locked down for most of the day. Movement is tightly controlled. Meals come on trays, slid through slots. Contact with the outside world shrinks to monitored phone calls and censored mail. For Jodi, who once courted the media with interviews, the silence of Perryville is its own kind of cage. Other inmates have spoken of her time inside, Jodi teaching art classes, sketching portraits, trying to build a small world in the middle of the fortress that now holds her. But make no mistake, maximum security is not a place of peace. It is a place where violence simmers beneath the surface, where the most dangerous women in the state serve their time. And it is where Jodi will stay until her last breath. Her story sits at level 4 of prison life, because it embodies what maximum security means. It is not temporary, like Felicity Huffman's 11 days. It is not the limbo of Casey Anthony's pretrial detention. It is a cage built for permanence, for those whose crimes are too severe, whose danger is too great, to ever risk freedom. Jodi Arias, once a young woman in love, is now inmate number 281129, locked behind reinforced doors. The name that filled headlines and cable news crawls is now just another file in a prison system that swallows people whole. And yet, the memory lingers. Not because she gives interviews, not because she paints or teaches art inside Perryville, but because of that crime scene in Mesa, the blood on the floor, the camera that betrayed her, the rage carved into Travis Alexander's body. That is what holds her in maximum security. That is why her name will always be spoken in the same breath as Perryville Prison. Life without parole doesn't just mean no release date. It means waking every morning to the same cement walls, the same iron bars, the same echo of gates slamming shut. For Jodi Arias, it is the sound of forever. Level 5. Patricia Krenwinkel. In 1969, Los Angeles was the epicenter of a cultural revolution: peace, love, music festivals, and rebellion against the establishment. But beneath the haze of flower power and free love, a darker current was running. That current was Charles Manson. And one of the women who followed him was Patricia Krenwinkel. Patricia was not a headline name before Manson. She was quiet, almost invisible, a young woman who had drifted into his orbit and never escaped. To those who met her in those years, she seemed shy, even gentle. But once Manson wrapped his influence around her, that shyness hardened into devotion. And in August 1969, that devotion turned her into a killer. The Tate LaBianca murders have been told and retold for decades. 7 lives stolen in 2 nights of chaos that shattered any illusion of the 1960s as a purely innocent era. Actress Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, was stabbed to death inside her Hollywood home. Guests who had come to enjoy a summer evening, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, were slaughtered. The following night, supermarket owner Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary met the same fate inside their own home. Patricia Krenwinkel was there. She wasn't just a bystander, she wielded the knife herself. She chased Abigail Folger across the lawn, stabbing her again and again, the blood spilling across the grass under a California moon. She carved words into walls with her victim's blood, following Manson's instructions to spread fear. The middle of this story, the part that has never loosened its grip on public imagination, is the sheer savagery of those nights. Patricia, along with the other family members, didn't just kill. They orchestrated horror. They tied victims up, taunted them, made their final moments ones of panic and terror. And then, when the blood had dried, they scrawled words on the walls to make sure the world understood. This was not just murder, it was a message. The trial in 1971 turned Manson and his followers into symbols of cult manipulation, of what happens when devotion turns into fanaticism. Patricia sat in the courtroom with an X carved into her forehead, a mark of loyalty to her leader. When she was convicted of 7 counts of murder, the jury originally sentenced her to death. But California's death penalty was struck down in 1972, and Patricia's sentence shifted to life in prison. And that is where the story of Level 5 begins. Patricia Krenwinkel has now spent more than 53 years behind bars. More than half a century of her life measured not by birthdays or milestones, but by parole hearings that come and go, each ending with the same decision: denied. Long-term sentences reshape a person in ways no short stay can. Prison becomes the only home. Guards change, wardens change, even the prison itself modernizes, but the inmate remains. For Patricia, decades have passed inside California's correctional system. She has aged from a young woman in her early 20s to a woman in her 70s, her youth swallowed by walls and wire. Unlike Jodi Arias in maximum security, Patricia's punishment is not simply the severity of her restrictions. It is the weight of time. Year after year, she has faced parole boards, expressing remorse, speaking of rehabilitation. But the crimes she committed are so deeply carved into America's cultural memory that release seems unthinkable. Each time her name resurfaces in headlines, it is tied not to who she has become, but to what she did in 1969. Her life is the embodiment of a long-term sentence, a sentence that doesn't end but stretches endlessly, reshaping identity, erasing any sense of the outside world. She has watched fellow family members die in custody. She has watched decades of cultural change. Computers, cell phones, social media, all from the inside. For her, the outside world is now more foreign than familiar, and yet she continues to exist within prison society. Reports describe her as someone who has mentored younger inmates, taken part in self-help programs, tried to atone for a past she can never erase. But remorse doesn't erase memories. It doesn't bring back Sharon Tate, or Abigail Folger, or the LaBiancas. The weight of those names sits heavy over every parole hearing, every request for release. Patricia Krenwinkel's case shows what happens when the law says life with the possibility of parole, but society says never. Her extended sentence is not just about punishment, it is about memory, about a nation unwilling to forget the summer of 1969, when the Manson family turned California into a nightmare. More than 50 years later, Patricia is still locked away. She may one day be released, but the shadow of those murders ensures that even if the prison gates open, she will never truly walk free. Level 6, Susan Smith.
Case number 34, Susan Smith.
October 25th, 1994. The sleepy town of Union, South Carolina, awoke to a nightmare that would seize the nation's attention. A young mother, Susan Smith, stood before television cameras, tears streaking down her face, pleading for the safe return of her 2 little boys. Michael, 3 years old, Alexander, just 14 months. She said a carjacker had taken them, driving off into the night with her sons still strapped in their car seats. America rallied around her. Flyers were printed, police checkpoints set up, and neighbors joined search parties. News anchors repeated her words as she begged the black man she described to bring her children back alive. For 9 days, the country believed her. For 9 days, she played the part of a grieving mother. Her sobs replayed in living rooms across every state. But underneath the cries and cameras was a truth too monstrous to imagine. The truth broke on November 3, 1994, when Susan confessed. There had been no carjacker, no stranger in the night. She had driven her Mazda protege to a lake, buckled Michael and Alex into their car seats, and released the handbrake. The car rolled forward, headlights piercing the dark water as her children screamed inside. She stood and watched as the vehicle disappeared beneath the surface, bubbles rising, the water closing over the only lives she was supposed to protect. This was the middle of the story, the part that froze America's heart. Not just the drowning, but the cold patience of a mother who stood on the bank while her children fought for air. No intruder to blame, no accident to explain. It was deliberate, calculated. She let the water do the killing for her. When investigators dredged the lake and pulled the Mazda from the depths, the image was seared into history. 2 small bodies strapped into car seats, lifeless, trapped in the final position their mother had placed them. Even hardened detectives broke down. The lie Susan Smith had spun shattered in an instant, replaced by the horror of what she had done. Her motive was as shallow as it was devastating. She had been in a relationship with a man who didn't want children. Instead of choosing her sons, she chose him. Or rather, the hope of him. In her confession, Susan admitted that she saw her boys as obstacles to love, burdens, standing in the way of her happiness. So, she erased them. At trial in 1995, the jury heard every detail. The 9-day deception, the staged press conferences, the calculated drowning. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that the crime was too cruel for anything less. But her defense leaned heavily on claims of depression, childhood trauma, and mental instability. In the end, the jury rejected execution but handed her a life sentence. Life with parole. The phrase sounds like hope, a dangling possibility that one day freedom might be earned. But in Susan Smith's case, parole was set at 30 years. 30 years before she could even ask for release. For 3 decades, she has sat behind bars at Leith Correctional Institution, her life frozen at the moment she rolled that car into the lake. This is what a virtual life sentence looks like, not the quick brutality of death row. not the endless repetition of a parole board saying denied, year after year, like Patricia Krenwinkel. Instead, it is the long wait, the long silence, the countdown to a date so far in the future that it feels unreachable. Susan Smith will be eligible for parole in 2025. By then, she will have spent more years in prison than Michael and Alex ever had to live. Even if the gates open, the world outside is not waiting with forgiveness. The public has not forgotten the image of her sobbing on national television, while knowing her children were already at the bottom of a lake. Inside prison, reports have surfaced of disciplinary problems, relationships with guards, infractions that paint a picture of a woman who never fully escaped the selfish impulses that led her there. But none of that overshadows the central truth. She is the mother who drowned her sons and lied to the world about it. Susan Smith's life sentence is not defined only by prison bars. It is defined by the memory of headlights sinking into black water, of children who never had a chance to grow up, of a nation betrayed by the performance of a grieving mother who wasn't grieving at all. Whether parole comes in 2025 or not, her name will forever be bound to that lake, that lie, and those 2 car seats pulled from the depths. That is what life with parole really means. Not freedom, not redemption, just a life marked by the possibility of release, shadowed by the certainty that no one will ever forget what you did. Level 7. Lisa Montgomery. On December 16, 2004, the small town of Skidmore, Missouri, became the epicenter of one of the most chilling crimes in American history. Bobby Jo Stinnett, 23 years old and 8 months pregnant, was found in her home, her body mutilated in a way that defied comprehension. She had been strangled with a rope until she lost consciousness. Then, while still alive, her abdomen was cut open with a kitchen knife. The baby she was carrying was removed and stolen. The woman responsible was Lisa Montgomery. To neighbors, she was a mother and wife who loved dogs, someone who blended into her community. But beneath that surface was a life marred by trauma, abuse, and deception. For years, Lisa had fabricated pregnancies, lying to family and friends, patting her stomach to convince others she was expecting. When those lies could no longer be sustained, she devised a plan that crossed into unthinkable territory. She had met Bobby Jo online, through a forum for dog breeders. On that December day, she drove to Bobby Jo's home under the pretense of buying a puppy. Once inside, she attacked. The brutality was intimate and deliberate. Hands tightening a rope, the fight for air, and then the cut that brought a child into the world by violence. The middle of this story, the moment that transfixed the nation, was not only the crime itself, but its aftermath. Lisa Montgomery left Bobby Jo bleeding to death on her bedroom floor and drove away cradling a newborn girl she presented as her own. To outsiders, she smiled, cooed, and introduced the infant as if she had just given birth. The deception was horrifying in its audacity, but the facade collapsed quickly. Bobby Jo's body was discovered within hours, and an Amber Alert spread across the Midwest. The next day, police traced the crime back to Lisa. They found her in Kansas, holding the baby in her arms. Miraculously, the infant survived and was returned to her family. The relief of that reunion stood in stark contrast to the horror of how she had entered the world. In 2007, Lisa Montgomery was convicted of federal murder. Prosecutors argued that her crime was calculated, that she had planned for months, targeting Bobby Jo specifically because she was pregnant and vulnerable. The defense countered with a portrait of a woman shattered by years of childhood abuse, sexual violence, and mental illness. But the jury was unmoved. They handed down the most severe punishment available: death. For 16 years, Lisa lived on federal death row, one of only a handful of women facing that fate. She spent her days inside the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, Texas, under the constant shadow of execution. Death row is its own kind of prison within a prison. Isolated, silent, each day marked by the knowledge that the government has scheduled the end of your life. Her execution date came in January 2021 after years of appeals and delays. At 52 years old, Lisa Montgomery was strapped down inside the execution chamber at the Terre Haute Federal Prison in Indiana. A lethal dose of pentobarbital was injected into her veins. At 1:31 a.m. on January 13th, she was pronounced dead. She became the first woman executed by the federal government in nearly 70 years. Her final hours were reported in detail: the pale green execution chamber, the small group of witnesses behind glass, and the quiet final breaths. It was the ultimate conclusion to a story that had begun with a fabricated pregnancy and ended with a mother's death and a child's miraculous survival. Level 7 represents the absolute edge of punishment. Life without parole and the death penalty strip away not just freedom, but the possibility of redemption in society's eyes. Lisa Montgomery's years on death row were not about rehabilitation. They were about waiting, for appeals, for courts, for the inevitable knock on the cell door that meant the time had come. Her name will forever be bound to the crime in Skidmore: the rope, the knife, the infant taken from the womb. A crime that forced people to confront the darkest corners of human behavior, the kind of act that makes even veteran investigators question what a person is capable of. For Bobby Joe Stinnett's family, justice came not in Lisa's death, but in the survival of the baby girl, who grew up without the mother who had loved her before she was even born. For the world, the case remains one of the most disturbing examples of obsession, deception, and violence ever carried out by a woman. Lisa Montgomery's story closes the arc of prison life. From short stays to life sentences, hers shows the final destination, a level where freedom is gone forever, and the only ending is an execution date on the calendar. 7 levels, 7 women, 7 very different faces of life behind bars. From a few days in minimum security to decades swallowed by long-term sentences, all the way to the silence of death row, we've seen how prison changes not just freedom, but identity, time, and memory itself. Some of these women will eventually walk out. Others will never again see the world beyond barbed wire. And for some, the state already carried out the final sentence. Yet in every story, one truth lingers. Prison is not just about punishment. It's about the choices that led there, and the shadows those choices cast across families, communities, and history. But now, I want to turn it over to you. Which of these 7 levels struck you the hardest? Was it the unbearable waiting of pretrial jail, the brief humiliation of a short-term stay, or the endless weight of a life sentence with no chance of release? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. And don't forget, if you found yourself pulled into these stories, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves true crime as much as you do, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the darker corners of justice. Because these stories don't just belong to the past, they're unfolding even now in prisons across the country. And sometimes, the only way to understand justice is to look at those who live it every single day.